Okay, how are you?
Fine, very well.
So, do you want to start off just by giving us your full name and current occupation, all that stuff?
Well, my name is Bernie Dillon, as anyone looking at this would be aware, and I'm currently retired and intend to stay that way.
Very good. And where do you come in the family?
I'd be number 3, Debbie, the oldest, Sheila next, then me, then Patch, Brendan and Joan, and I suppose Patch and Sheila would be the closest to me. I was in between them. Sheila was only about 10 months older than I was, and Patch probably about 14 months or so younger than me, so they were fairly close. The others were further apart, like Debbie was 5 years older than I was, and Brendan and Joan would be approaching that kind of gap as well on the other end.
Okay.
Joan more so than.
So, growing up, would you say you were close to then Sheila and Patch, or?
Well, probably, maybe closer to Patch. He, being a boy, would probably be closer, and we'd be doing, I suppose, boy type things in relation to playing games or the things we'd get into. Whereas Sheila would probably be off doing her own kind of things.
What type of things did you get into?
Well, it depends on the age level. I mean, mostly, at younger age we'd be playing around, and later it would be off maybe doing a bit of fishing or wandering around the village or seeing what was happening or trying to keep out of mischief.
Any mischief that you care to share on the camera that you got into?
No, well, probably not. I think most of the mischief we might have got into would be, around at home where, there'd be the usual fights or arguments between siblings. I probably would be blamed maybe for initiating some of these, but I certainly got blamed by my parents for initiating them, whether I did or not, or if anything, happened. Like, I think on one occasion, I think it was Patch rather than Brendan. Patch was running after me, whatever bit of an argument or discussion we might have. He was running after me with a stone in his hand to throw at me, and I, ran around the corner of the house, and of course, as soon as he saw me disappearing, he threw the stone and it went through the window. Needless to say, I got blamed for it. It was my fault, like I threw the stone, even though it was like I should have stood there and be hit.
Right, would you say there's no smoke without fire? So, I mean, would you have said, in terms of activities, would you have been the troublemaker, or you just were unfairly treated?
With siblings, I presume. Oh yeah, you'd hold your own. I mean, with siblings, sure, everyone starts trouble or problems at different times.
But how would you describe yourself then relative to the others?
It's hard to say. I mean, relative to the boys or relative to girls. I mean, the two boys at either end, like Debbie and Debbie, we hardly knew, because he was 5 years older than me and 4 years older than Sheila. So he was much more, advanced growing up than we were, and then he went off to, boarding school at probably around 12 or something, and we wouldn't have seen much of him after that, so we wouldn't have the same kind of connection, I suppose, with him as you might with, with some of the others. Again, the ones that would be very young, you wouldn't have that connection either necessarily, because your turn came and you went off to boarding school, so you kind of lost a certain amount of contact, with the two younger ones, Brendan and Joan.
Okay.
Now, Patch went to the same boarding school as I did, so would have had more, connection with him growing up to our early, teenage years.
So do you want to describe a bit about the boarding school?
Boarding school was in the Augustinians in Garvan. It was a small boarding school by normal standards. I think there was about 120, 130 students that had been probably there was 6 years of it for you tend to skip a year. You did only 5 years, but they actually had 6 years of classes, so there'd be about 20 in each year, and just the one class, and it was all boarders. There might have been 2 or 3 so-called day pupils that came in, but it was mainly all boarders, and it wasn't that bad. I suppose the difference was in those days, we're going back now to the early 50s. You lost connection, with home to a large extent, because you only got home during the holidays, and there was no midterm breaks or anything like that, nor did your parents or any of your family come to visit you. And of course there was no phone calls or mobile phones or anything like that, or even regular phones to make contact. So the only contact was via letter. You had to write home and they wrote to you and that kind of thing. So you were fairly disconnected from it.
So you went to 12 to 17
Well,
roughly, was it?
I think it might have been 13 in my case. I think I might have been just 13.
And what was that like at that age? To go away?
Well, initially, obviously, it was lonely because the first time you were really away for any extended period of time.
Yeah.
But it was a nice boarding school, and you got adjusted to it easy enough, and there was none of this so-called bullying or anything like that, in the school, because I suppose it was small, and everybody, I suppose, respected everybody else.
Okay. So you found it okay anyway?
I did. I enjoyed it. But again, it was like any school, I suppose. I liked playing football and things like that, and that was a big thing in the school. If you were into football, you were not exactly one of the lads as such, but you got treated maybe a little bit better.
Okay. That's good. And did Patch play football with you around the same time, in the same team or anything like that?
Well, no, he wouldn't have. He wouldn't have been big into sports. Well, that would be my view of it anyway. But he might feel differently. But no, he wouldn't have been. He would have played because everybody. I think everybody in the school played except. I think there was like 3 or 4 that were conscientious objectors, and were allowed to get away with it. I don't know whether they had some medical certs or whatever, but they would have to go off for a walk while we were playing sports, or they'd have to come with us and walk around then, because the playing fields were I'd say about a mile away from the college, so we had to walk there. So I think that would have been brought along, but they didn't participate.
Okay. Do you want to describe just a little bit, because obviously, the younger generation won't appreciate the times back then. Maybe for school first, I guess noticeable differences, or just the day-to-day activities, and how you'd notice things that are different from nowadays.
Well, I suppose to put it in context, in those early years, like say, I was born in 1938, which was, the World War II broke out shortly afterwards. Nothing to do with I being born, obviously. Rationing was imposed in Ireland, and it was in the UK as well. And that lasted, I think, until, pretty much the end of the 40s. It went on after the war. The war was over in 45. But a lot of things were very scarce. Things like butter was rationed, flour was rationed, sugar was rationed, and you had ration books, and you got so much per how many units were in the family, and there was no petrol, or and in those days as well in Ballydesmond there was no electricity. The electricity didn't come in until around 1950, when I was going off to boarding school. So obviously there was no television. Even if you had the electricity, you wouldn't have had television, because all the television was coming from the UK. So people along the East Coast would have been able to receive it, but not where we were. So there was no running water in the house and lots of things like that. So you had no central heating, none of those benefits. So it was, in the winter time, it was pretty miserable. Bottom line, I mean, when you went to bed at night, you were frozen for about a half an hour till you physically warmed up the bed. And when you got up in the morning, you could, you just like that, you could see your breath come out in front of you in the air.
So what would have, I mean, in all that hardship, what was there, which I'm sure there were tough times, what would have been a treat?
Well, the treats, I suppose, were, I'm not sure now going back to that. Well, I suppose, yes, in those days ice cream was available. And this is where this expression that you hear every so often about a 2-penny and a 3-penny ice cream, because a block of ice cream was 2 shillings, which for people who don't know is actually 24 pence in the old days, in 2 shillings. So a 2-penny would have been 1/12 of a block. And if you went down to the local shop, you could buy a 2-penny ice cream or a 4-penny ice cream of that. So I mean that
With a wafer, was it? Or?
Well, with the wafer, yeah. Well, you might get a wafer and a half. You might get 2 full ones. So I mean that carried over to the house, obviously, where you might buy a block occasionally, and that would be the treat. Now, of course, this was probably a bit later in life in the years, but obviously, if a block of ice cream was bought, it was consumed. There was no plan to keep it, for any length of time. But also you didn't have any, well, we had a radio, but you only heard the radio was only turned on for the news or something special that might be on, because the radio in those days had what we called a wet battery and a dry battery. The dry battery was the kind of battery we're familiar with now, but the wet battery was like your car battery, had liquid acid in it, and it was rechargeable. So you'd have to take that off and go off to in our case we were fortunate because it was Ryan's next door, and he had a windmill on the chimney which operated a little generator, and he was the only place around that I knew of that could charge these batteries. So you took it to him and he kept it for a day or two or something. Of course, in that time you had no radio.
Yeah, very good. You mentioned sport just as well. I mean, growing up, did you want to?
Well, there was very little sports activity in Ballydesmond, because as we were growing up, I mean, we used to, well, I suppose we wouldn't even have a football. I mean, in the early years, I mean, one of the big thrills was if you happened to, know that, a farmer was killing a pig or something, and you'd go along for the killing of the pig, and all you wanted to really get was the bladder.
Yeah.
Which you got the bladder, which is a pretty slimy old thing at the best of times, but you were able to blow it up, and and tie it off, and you could kick it around as a football, and it lasted for not too long because it got, as it dried out, it got hard, and eventually it cracked and it burst. But you got a few days fun out of it before it disappeared.
Right.
But as we got a bit older, where you would have a football, or got some kind of football to kick around, I mean, we'd be, because there was no football team in the area or anything, you'd be going into different fields around the village there trying to, play a bit of football, since we didn't have a field. But we were always chased out of them, and you'd go back then when you thought it was safe again and kick around some more. But it kept being hoosted out of fields, kicked out. In other words, even the field next door to us, which is owned by our uncle, we weren't allowed go in there. And even though cutting across that field was a shortcut to go to school, we weren't, officially we weren't allowed use that as a shortcut by my uncle. But I mean, obviously, if he was anyway observant, there was a pathway worn along the field. You could see where we went, got in and climbed up over the ditch to get onto the road to walk up to school.
And so, I mean, sport-wise, there wasn't a kind of a local team or anything? Or
No, not in those. It was much later when the local teams started to come around the place. You know, it was much later. Much later as far as I was concerned. I would have been into my well. I don't think it was even a team there when I was into my late teens. You know, it was after that. It was after I'd say I went to university that they had a team in Ballydesmond.
right.
Now I played with John Tariff, but I mean that was probably 15 miles away. You know, I played with him minor football, and so did you know, Devi in his day. But you know, there was nothing closer than that.
How would you get to the games?
Or they'd come and pick you up. You know, they'd send what might be loosely termed a taxi, but it would probably be some local volunteer who got some payment for it, would come and pick up, you know, 3 or 4 people along the route or whatever.
Okay. Did you do training or anything like that, or was it just games? Or
Well, it was mostly games. There wasn't much training. Well, you see, you wouldn't be around that much because we were in secondary school, and I mean, you'd have done your training in secondary school, so you were home for the summer sometimes, but I mean, you'd be off doing other things during the summer. We did do a bit of training locally, but it was very, you know, it was very limited because there wasn't that many people, you know, participating, and there was no formal team, and there was nothing to drive people on.
right, okay. Come back to that in a little bit. Just want to spend a bit of time then on your parents and your family history. What you know of it. If you can-
Yeah, while others would probably give you a better background on that, I think Debbie in particular would probably be better. But basically, I mean, my father, his name was Patrick, you know, Patrick Michael, and he was from Ballyconry in North Kerry, back near Ballybunion. I suppose it would be pretty close. It was about 3 miles, I think, from Ballybunion, where he came from, and he obviously came to Ballydesmond as a national school teacher. Well, near Ballydesmond, he was actually in Foyle, which is about 2 miles up the road, and my mother maiden name was Joyce, and I think originally they probably came from Galway. Her father probably came from Galway, but she and most of her siblings, I think, were born in West Cork, I think it was called Castle Townsend, and obviously came to Ballydesmond. Her family came to Ballydesmond. Her father was an RIC constable. I think he might have been the local sergeant in those days. You know, came there as a single person.
So, in terms of them, I mean, growing up, then your relationship with your parents.
Well, they were both national school teachers, so I suppose they would.
Were you in their school?
Well, I was in my mother's school for a while, but she had to move out of there because the numbers dropped, and she actually ended up going back to a place called Onablaw, which was about, I don't know, maybe 10 miles away, and she used to go spend, I suppose, 3 or 4 nights of the week there. She'd go on a Sunday evening, I think, come back for one night in the middle of the week, and then go again. But she took Brendan and Joan with her, so they went to school back there with us, and then the rest of us, went to the local national school. Those of us who were still at national school stage.
So she was 3 nights a week maybe away.
I'd say, yeah, probably. Well, she would have been Sunday, Monday, maybe Wednesday, Thursday. Can't think, 4 nights probably.
And who'd look after you? Was it your dad or
Well,
did you have
yeah,
someone else?
we looked after ourselves to. She would have done most of the background work, obviously. Well, when we were much younger, we had a maid. I don't know if that's quite the right phrase or not, but we had, a live-in housekeeper.
Yeah, okay.
And you know, she looked after us obviously when we were quite young, but as we grew up a bit and started going to school, you know, that was dispensed with. So no, most of the dinners and stuff would be, you know, would be got ready, or things would be got ready, and that was one of the. It had its pluses in a way, because when you were I know in my time when I was there, you know, I used to get out of school early to come home and put the dinner on, so it would be ready for my father when he got home at, I think maybe 3:15 or something. I was allowed out of school early to come home and, you know, start doing the dinner and things like that, which you know, was kind of strange that it had to be ready when he got home, but we thought that was normal, and so did everybody else, and the local schoolmaster didn't have any problem with it either.
So did you just put it on, or did you have to prepare it as well?
Well, I think it was mostly putting it on. There might be some preparation, but I think it was mostly, you know, it was mostly putting it on, getting it, you know, cooking as it were.
So you have some culinary skills then, yeah?
Not too many, no, limited amount. But I used to get off of school for a variety of reasons. That happened to be one, where you get out early. I mean, other situations, which in, you know, current situation sounds a bit ludicrous, but I used to get off school for, you know, when there was elections on, you know, national elections, I used to get off school to come home. Well, first of all, usually around the middle of the day for an hour or two to get the results, you know, first count results or multiple count results on the radio, and I'd have to write all the results down so that my father would then they'd be ready for him when he got home, rather than me having to wait till 6 o'clock news or whatever. He'd have them from the 1 o'clock news. And I used to also get off school for, well, there wouldn't be too many days. I mean, that only occurred obviously very infrequently, that situation, because elections weren't that frequent. I used to also get off to go to coursing meetings. My father was big into greyhounds in those days. We always had about 5 or 6 greyhounds, and I was always quite involved with him in various aspects of them. But one aspect was there'd be coursing meetings in somewhere in North Kerry or somewhere else like that, and I used to go with the local butcher, who was big into greyhounds as well, and we might have 1 or 2 of our dogs and a couple of his dogs, and we'd go off with those, and I'd be looking after ours, you know, at the coursing meeting and stuff, because my father couldn't take time off school, but it was okay for me to do it.
So were you the only one in the family doing that? Or?
In the greyhound? No, I think I was, yes. I don't think anyone else got involved, because I was involved in the so-called training of them, like I'd take them for walks early in the morning for so long, and then I used to go off to the racetrack back typically to Tralee with my father and look after them. There was one dog in particular who was very nervous and only 2 people could handle him, either me or my father, so I used to have to take him on the parade before the race and pick him up afterwards, after the race, obviously, when they cover the old hair at the end of the race and the dogs are milling around.
So how did you end up with that?
I don't know,
job?
I suppose I must have been the most appropriately aged one, you know, at the time when that was going on.
Right.
And, you know, there'd be training sessions then which were, you know, they were tough sessions, because the dogs obviously were much more attached to my father than they were to me or anybody else. And we'd go off into, you know, a large field in the locality, and I'd have to hold, you know, maybe 3 or 4 dogs here while he walked up the length of the field, and these, you know, jumping around to go after him. And then when he was up at the end, he'd take off his hat and wave it, and I had to let the dogs go.
What age were you?
Oh, I don't know, it
that.
must have been. This would be before I went to secondary school.
Okay.
So I might be 10 or 11, 12, you know, and sometimes, of course, you had the way you held on to them is they all had collars on, and you had one lead, that was slipped through the collars,
Right.
and you were holding that, and then you let one end of it go, and you're supposed to hang on to the other end. And of course, sometimes they make such a burst, both ends would go, and that wasn't appreciated. When
So-
one of them ended up with this lead hanging out of them because they could step on it and
Yeah.
break a leg or something, and that'd be disastrous.
So did you see that as a kind of special time with your dad looking back, or even at the time?
Oh yeah.
Or was there a bit of a job element to it that
Well, there was some of it was a job. I mean, the walking the dogs in the morning and holding them on back when he was walking up the field was definitely a job element, work element, of which you got, paid for.
okay.
Small amounts of money, I might add. But I mean, obviously going off to the track and things like that was always, exciting. And you got to, with the few bob you earned, you'd put it on your dog to win, which 99 times out of 100 was a big mistake. So you learned, to be very skeptical of betting on horses or dogs or anything after that.
Right.
And now I might be tempted to put a bet on if they were already past the post, but otherwise, no.
Very good. So, I mean, I guess then just to touch on then your relationship growing up, really. I mean, you're describing how your mother was kind of away for some of the nights anyway, and then there was obviously your time in secondary school, and then you talked about the dogs there. How would you describe your relationship with your parents?
I would say generally pretty good. I mean, my mother would have probably been the disciplinarian in the family, as it were. She's the one that made you toe the line, or certainly would be taking the initiative in relation to it. And on a regular basis, you'd be getting this threat about wait till your father comes home, anything kind of stuff. But she would have made all the important decisions, I suppose, in relation to her education, and obviously in relation to, she would obviously be looking after all our needs in relation to clothes and food and all of that. But also I think in relation to things that needed to get done around the house, not necessarily by us but by tradespeople or anything like that. She would take the initiative, and my father would would probably tend to go along with it. I mean, his favourite pastime would have been probably sitting at the table or by the fire, reading the paper or doing a crossword, and maybe drinking a cup of tea and smoking a cigarette. And I mean, for a good part of his life he would have smoked a huge number of cigarettes, because if you had a memory of him smoking, it would have been he lighting the next one from the one he was just finishing.
Yeah.
And I'd say he would have smoked, I don't know, if I had to put an estimate on it, I would say maybe as much as 60 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
Which in the current environment is a huge amount, which obviously came against him in later life.
Yeah.
But maybe as a result of that, I think, not that it came before it came against him, but I think as a result of that, I think that there was very little smoking done by anyone else in the family. I mean, at different times they might have smoked a bit, but by and large, they wouldn't have smoked at all or have it all given up. But everybody's done that nowadays, pretty much, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. So what would be then, I mean, if you were to describe your, I don't know if role is the right word, but I suppose your place in the family, I mean, were you the joker or the worker, or what were you?
Well, it certainly wouldn't be the joker. I'd say I was definitely the worker, if I was anything, or the organiser of the work. I remember we used to, like most people in the country, we'd cut turf every year, enough for the family. And of course, cutting turf is, well, I mean, we wouldn't actually be cutting it. I mean, there'd be a man hired to cut it, but we'd be there probably having to, take it from him and spread it out in the bank, which was, was tough, tough work,
Yeah.
because some of these guys were like, were like a machine. They just keep turning the sods out, and if you didn't get them away in time, then I'd say they'd bury you in the stuff before they'd stop. But I mean, after that, when it dries a bit, then you have to stoke it, and you've turn it first and then stoke it and stuff. But when we'd be saving it, as it would be called, saving the turf, as it were, I mean, I would be inclined to give people, a signed amount of space, so that everybody was doing their fair share, as opposed to just mucking in and breaking your back, doing all the work, and there'd be a few of the others would be quite happy to stand back looking at you.
Okay.
They shall be nameless.
Well, that might come out. So, and how is that? How do you think your siblings would describe you then?
Well, who knows how they would describe you?
Find out soon enough.
We'll find out, obviously, when you do further interviews, or when we see the finished article.
Yeah. Okay. So, tell us a bit then, just about the Dillons in Ballydesmond, and two teachers. How would you have been regarded in the town? I mean, were you people of respect? Would that be respected or whatever? Or what,
Well, I think you would. I think when you're part of the thing, you're not conscious of it. I think because you're just there. But obviously, with two, teachers in the family, I mean, teachers were, respected. I mean, there were. I mean, we didn't, in the locality, there were hardly any large farmers as such, and there certainly weren't any large shopkeepers, because it was a small village. There was small shopkeepers, and there was oodles of small farmers. So I would say the hierarchy in the parish as such would be the parish priest, and the teachers would be would be looked up to there. And and later in life, when we were still young, I mean, my father was a peace commissioner, so you'd have people coming into the house getting things signed or approved of that, or it was either kind of he would do it, or probably the local Garda station sergeant or that would do it.
Okay.
So obviously a lot of them would prefer to come to my father, or rather than going to the guards as such. But the guards would have been looked at as in a very benevolent kind of way as well, because they there was very little, if any, crime as such in the time. I mean, everybody kind of mind their own business. I mean, people weren't mobile at the time. There was very few motor cars as I was growing up. I mean, and during the war years and the rationing years, we had a car, but I think there might be no more than 2 or 3 cars around in the village of that. We had a car, but we had no petrol to run it. So I mean, you'd get whatever, I don't know, where my father might get the odd gallon of petrol.
Yeah.
So he'd take the car out for a run maybe once a month or something. We'd all pile in and go for a little drive on it, just to warm up the engine, and then we'd go back and you'd go back in the garage and stay there.
Right.
Obviously later, when all that was over, things were were different. I mean, petrol stuff was available. So I mean, it was a very kind of enclosed community to some extent. You wouldn't have a lot of passers-by. I mean, lots of people travelled either in bicycles or on horse and cart or horse and trap or something like that. That was the modes of transport.
Yeah.
For most people, it would be cycle, no matter how far away it was.
Yeah.
Would be cycling.
Okay. And so, do you think, being just in terms of the parents being teachers and stuff, and you said the role in the community, was there extra pressure or kind of, be it from kids with a bit of slagging, or just pressure to kind of, because your parents were teachers, to be good or whatever, or to not get into trouble or?
No, well, I wasn't, conscious of it, that there was pressure, from my parents and stuff like that, and there certainly wouldn't be any slagging that I was aware of or experienced from other kids around the place. I think if we got into mischief or something like that, I think we probably got away with it because people maybe didn't want to come and complain to our parents a lot of the time.
Okay.
So I think that was a benefit.
All right.
But certainly it didn't have any downside that I was aware of.
Okay, good. So touching a bit there now on things there. Just want to touch a bit on then back to the education side of things, and I guess as you said, you described the Augustinians in Dungarvan. Were you good in the class, or what would the teachers say about you if they were to pass comment on you? Let's say?
Well, I would say I was in the. Well, it wasn't brilliant for sure. I mean, I did my work and stuff like that, or as much as was necessary. I would probably have made maybe in certain subjects I would certainly be in the upper quartile or near the, or near the top, or say in maths I would have been almost certainly at the top, and the results would benefit that. In other subjects, languages and stuff, I wouldn't have been that great at. In fact, I'd probably have been mediocre at best.
Right.
But like I said, the school was a small one, so that everything was under, was under fairly tight control. There was no major opportunities for skiving off or things like that. I mean, you might be able to, jump over the wall and go out around the town occasionally, but not very often, because Dungarvan was a small town as well. You'd be you'd be known immediately as one of the Friary boys, as the place was called. It was called the Friary. So you couldn't skive off around the town without probably word getting back, fairly quickly.
Were you privileged to go to the Augustinians?
Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think in those days. I mean, well, my impression is that boarding school in those days, wasn't that, expensive relative to what it would be nowadays. And again, we're talking relativities. But again, they wouldn't have the same facilities in these boarding schools as they have nowadays. And the other thing, I suppose, is that the orders like the Augustinians were motivated to do this as a kind of a recruitment ground for priests for their own order, which was, I presume, the original idea of when it was set up. But obviously, as the years went by, less and less students were putting their hand up and saying, I'd like to join the order, and there was no heavy recruitment went on, but every year, or at least when you got into fifth year, which was your second last year there, you'd skipped fourth year and you were in fifth year. They would, you'd all be interviewed to see what your, intentions were, and what you wanted to do with yourself after you left, and whether you were interested in joining the priesthood and things like that. But no arm twisting or anything like that.
Okay, so you never felt but despite the arm twisting, or lack of it, you never felt the desire to go into the priesthood, or did you ever think about it?
Well, never seriously. I mean, and I remember when I was doing my intercept, which I did after 3 years in those days. I mean, I had, I was doing Latin and Greek as well as, Irish and English, and I had decided I was giving up Latin. I didn't want to keep doing that anymore, and I knew I'd have a hassle doing that, give it up after the inter. So I deliberately decided when I went in to do my inter that I wasn't going to do very well in Latin, so we used to have outside supervisors, and I remember in the exam, doing the exam, which was, I don't know, was probably about 2 hours or exam, or maybe 3, I'd say maybe 2. But anyway, in about less than half an hour, I had finished the paper. I did every single question on the paper, even where you were only supposed to do A or B. I did A and B. And I went up to the supervisor to hand in my paper. Of course, he thought I must be sick or something. And he says, "Are you finished?" I says, "Oh yeah." I says, "I've answered all the questions." And I handed him my paper. Now, if you knew anything about Latin, you'd probably see it was a whole lot of rubbish, but I didn't care. So, and I can still remember to this day, because that was 1954.
Okay.
And I got 54 marks in the exam. Now, that was 54 out of 400, I think. Not
Okay.
out of 400. So then, of course, when I came back after, after the summer back in the, and I had started making my representations for giving up Latin, and it took a long time to convince them to give it up. They put every possible roadblock in my way. They first of all they said, "What are you planning on doing when you leave?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to university, I'm doing engineering." I had my mind made up at that stage. And they said, "Well, you can't go to university unless you have Latin." I said I have Greek, and I said I've made some inquiries, and they said, "Well, we know better," as it were. So I had, of course, there was no career guidance, by the way. I had to write to UCD and get them to send me the entry requirements for engineering or matriculation, which you had to do. And of course, it came back, and it was I forget what it said. It was Latin, French, Greek, or a modern continental language. So I went in armed with this to show them, said, "Look, this is, it says here." So I meet the requirements because I'm doing Greek. So then they said, "Well, no, we can't let you do that unless we have a letter from your parents." So now I have to write home and explain to them that I want to give up Latin and my rationale for all this, and I've got a letter back saying, "Yeah, okay," so I go with this. So they finally relented, and of course it was only afterwards I realised why they were on about it so much. There was 2 reasons. I mean, one was that as soon as word got out that I had given up Latin, there was a lineup of about 10 others out of the class wanted to give it up.
Yeah.
And of course they didn't let any of them give it up. Nobody else. And I found out later then, of course, later that year when we were being interviewed for our inclinations to join in the priesthood and anything like that, I found out, of course, when I went in to be interviewed by the prior, I think it was, I knew what the story was at that stage, so I told him I had given up Latin. And of course then that was a no, because Latin was the language of the mass and everything else in those days, and if you didn't have Latin, you weren't a runner.
Yeah.
So we had a very quick interview.
Very good. So tell us then just a little bit about choosing engineering and third level education.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to know, I suppose, what kind of thought process you go through at 16 or 17 years of age, but I had decided I wanted to do engineering. I wasn't 100%, I suppose, what kind of engineering, but I had in my mind that it was engineering or architecture. To me, in those days, they were almost one and the same thing. I mean, I found out much later that they were totally different, and I was glad I didn't do architecture, but I decided to do, electrical engineering. And Cork at the time had only just started electrical engineering. Cork used CC, so Dublin was the only place you could do it. You couldn't do it in Galway either. And in fact, guys from Galway used to come after their first year doing engineering, which was all disciplines. In Galway, they used to come up and join us in Dublin. So I don't know why I ended up doing it. It just appealed to me, I suppose. electrical stuff.
Okay, so there's no kind of mentor or anyone
Oh, no,
advising you or otherwise,
I
or
didn't know any engineer, and I certainly didn't know any electrical engineer.
so it's more maybe because you were good at maths or whatever, and you thought,
Well, that was part of it, but again, I worked at the maths because maths was one of the main requirements for the entry to the thing. It was called honours maths in those days. I suppose it's higher maths now or something. And there was about, I think, 5 or 6 of us in a class doing honours maths.
okay,
The rest doing the ordinary maths. And I put a lot of effort in, obviously, to make sure I did well in that, because that was a key requirement to be able to do that.
yeah. Anything you want to talk about in terms of your time at university?
Time at university? No. I suppose it's fair to say that I would say the majority of the lecturers were pretty useless, in my opinion. And when I left there, I felt I didn't know very much about electrical engineering. That was when I left there. Subsequently, after I did my master's degree and stuff, I was absolutely convinced I knew nothing about electrical engineering when I left UCD. So, but I suppose maybe most people feel that way.
Yeah, interesting.
But again, it was kind of in its infancy in those days, and but the quality of the lectures were pretty poor. I mean, we had one guy in there who'd come in and of course, the lecturers used to smoke in the classroom in those days. I mean, he'd have his notes written on the back of his cigarette box, the little bit you push out, and that's all he'd have. Now, the only good thing about him, and he was in electrical engineering as such, the power side of it. The only good thing about him was that about a month before the exams, he'd obviously lost all his cigarette boxes that he'd ever kept them. He'd come in and he'd ask about 10 things, had we covered X, Y, Z, about 10 items, and you knew those were on the exam paper. So you went off and you focused on those and studied on those and forgot about everything else.
Okay. So how long was it after that before you, I guess, met Kathleen and then going to the States?
Well, it would have been during university days because we lived about 8 miles apart at home.
Okay.
And I mean, we'd have been going to the same the same dances, which would have been mostly in Mill Street, which was a big place. I mean, they'd have a few dances, and there used to be dances in Ballydesmond. They had a big hall there, and there'd be the occasional dancing Guinea-Gwilla or somewhere else, or Rathmore, but that was about it. And there'd be bigger dances back in Killarney, but that'd be too far away. You wouldn't go there. So I suppose you'd go to Mill Street more often than anywhere else if there wasn't somewhere else local. So I mean, Kathleen was going to UCG, I suppose the relationship built up. I mean, I had decided before I graduated that I was going off to the States. I mean, Sheila was in the States at the time, and you were able to get into the States in those days if you were sponsored by somebody. You didn't have to have a job.
Okay.
So she was able to do that, but I had decided I was going, because the only job opportunities in those days for an electrical engineer in Ireland was you could join what was known as the Post and Telegraphs at the time, so the radio kind of thing was, you could join the ESB, and that was about it. If you went, a lot of them used to go on, I suppose there'd be apprenticeships to the UK, go to some Phillips or Mullen or somebody over there, and I think a few people might go off to Germany to Siemens, but that didn't, appeal to me that much. But I also kind of decided I wanted to focus in on electronics and stuff, even though we did very little electronics in UCD at the time, because it was only a starting, a starting activity. So I decided I was going off to the States, to see how I'd, get on over there, rather than subjecting myself to, to those things. So that's kind of how I decided. Kathleen went off to teach in England for a year in some, posh private school. And so after a year I came back and came back on a visit, basically, and we decided to get married, and we decided to do it immediately. While Kathleen was apprehensive about going off to the States if she was married, I think that was driven by her mother telling her that she should, go off as a married woman, not as a single person. I mean, those issues wouldn't arise nowadays, but obviously that was the thinking at the time. So we decided to organise it all and got it all done and organised inside of 3 weeks, and that was it, as it were. We both then took off for the States.
Okay. So that was how long? A year after you?
Yeah, a year after I graduated. Yeah.
Where were you for that year?
In the States.
And you came back?
Yeah, came back on a holiday for
Okay.
a week or 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks, and extended it to 3 weeks to get the wedding fitted in.
So were you still were you kind of going out or whatever, or in touch with each other?
Oh yeah, we were, yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, not like you just happened upon.
Oh yeah. No, well I mean it was kind of all I suppose quasi arranged that Kathleen was going to come to the States with me.
Okay.
I suppose it was mother threw a spanner in the works and said, she'd be much happier if she was married going to the States.
Okay.
So that drove that.
So tell us then about the States and what you got up to over there.
Well, it was good. I mean, mostly, like I say, I worked with 2 different companies there. One was initially it was a very large company, Raytheon, which is still a well-known company.
Mm-hmm.
They do an awful lot in the military electronics side of things, and developed a lot of missiles and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the section I was in, I was working in applications kind of thing, where people would, we were selling, vacuum tubes, specialised vacuum tubes in those days, and we used to help people either design them into equipment that they were making or whatever. I mean, like televisions and everything, all those kind of things were just had vacuum tubes in those days. I mean, transistors were only in their infancy, really in their infancy, and had limited power, limited capability. So it was, it was all vacuum tubes. So we'd be doing that kind of work, or if somebody had, which happened quite often, obviously, they'd have designed a vacuum tube into a circuit, a specialized circuit or something, and the first batch that they got worked fine, but the next batch of tubes and equipment they made didn't work anymore, this kind of thing. And of course it was because it was a crummy design in the first place. They didn't design it properly and we'd have to go and provide a solution for them and do those kind of things.
Yeah.
So it was that kind of work. So I worked at that thing for I'd say about 2.5 years with Raytheon, and then I went off to work for a smaller company called Transonics, which was all their work was for the military. Most of what they did was they designed sensors for a whole variety of things. They would either be for submarines or for jet aircraft or things like that. You'd be designing equipment in, and I was in charge of one, electronic design section where we would be designing things so it could be used to measure typical kind of things. Would measure. One interesting one, to give an example, was in the these were the old nuclear subs now. They had they'd have waste oil that they'd have to get rid of, but they couldn't they couldn't put it out into the ocean, not because they were environmentally concerned or anything like that, but that would tell the enemy, if there was an enemy, there's a someone underneath that dripping oil on the surface. So they used to have to keep it in the ballast tanks that they had in the submarine. So we had designed equipment which would measure the oil water interface, and how the depth of it, so that they didn't put too much oil in there, so that because these ballast tanks were open at the at the bottom, when they blew out when they would blow out the water, or to rise the surface of things like that. So it was that kind of thing. So we'd have to go off to the the shipyard and the initial prototypes and stuff. These would be installed, and you'd have to see how they were operating and things like that.
Right. So how long were you there?
Well, I was there for 3.5 years. Is it 3.5 years? Because I was in the States 6 years altogether.
Okay, so it was that stage you decided to come back to Ireland?
Well, at that stage, I suppose.
Or what happened? What brought you back to Ireland?
Well, I suppose it was kind of more. It was at school starting age kind of thing, and Patrick was there as well. So it was it was either kind of you go back now and see if you can make it work, or you decide to stay in the States. And Kathleen was keen to come home, keener than I was, but I was prepared to try it out and see, because if it didn't work, we could always go back. So that was a kind of a 2-year period there that, well, okay, Maura would be in infants or high infants, and if she went back to the States, she, as a 6-year-old kind of thing, she would fit back in, and there'd be no big problem. So that was kind of, I suppose, that focused the timing of it, rather than it just dragging on a bit longer.
And then how come, just to deviate a little bit, the 3 of the 6 kids ended up in the States, and you were there obviously for a while and came back. I don't know if Divvy and Patch were ever over there, were they? Or?
No.
Why? I mean, was that normal to have that many kids go to the States, or was there
Well, I think
anything
in
in
those
particular
days, I think you're looking back at the, I suppose, 50s and 60s, and there was a lot of immigration out of the country.
Yeah.
So it was quite normal for, lots of children of families to immigrate. And I mean, in those days, it was almost like it was a one-way ticket. People weren't coming back. We were starting to get into the 70s, but when people were starting to come back and forth a little bit. But up to then, it was a one-way ticket. But it was it wasn't unusual, I suppose. The job opportunities were there. There weren't. The job opportunities just weren't in Ireland.
Yeah.
And that was the long and the short of it.
So were you near the others? Were the others there at the same time, or that you were there, or?
No, Sheila was there. She was the only one that was there at the time. John and Brendan went out after I would have come back.
Okay. Were you living near Sheila?
Oh yeah, well sure. Oh yes, very close. We were both in Boston, and we were both in the same, general area. in Boston. So we were.
Okay.
I mean, we'd see each other.
And obviously Marnie's the
Right.
same age as...
Yeah,
More or
Barney
less,
was the
so-
same age, exactly.
Okay. Alright. So then coming back to Ireland, I mean, would you have had any... I mean, sure there was, I suppose, a bit of apprehension or whatever, but having come back, was there any desire to go back over, or were you happy enough, or what do you
Well,
think?
well, I'd say we probably settled in reasonably quickly, but we were fortunate enough, I suppose, that I got, reasonable jobs fairly quickly. I mean, I got a job with EI, which was a subsidiary of General Electric in Shannon, very quickly. I mean, the first couple of weeks I didn't do anything after I came home. I just, took it easy. And I went for an interview. It wasn't the first interview I went for, but I'd gone for a couple of interviews up here in Dublin with, they were newer startup companies, American companies, but I went for an interview in with EI in Shannon, and I mean which was a big company at the time. I mean they had, by Irish standards at the time they were huge. They probably had 1,000 employees making kind of things, and the head of engineering there was an American, and he said to me, you're just what we're looking for. And he says, when can you start? I says, well, fairly soon. He says, what about Monday? I said, fine. I said, I have a problem that, I need to find somewhere to live and stuff. He says, that's no problem. He says, we have, and then here we can get you an apartment in the block of flats that they have there.
Right.
Right away, which they did. And so, then shortly after that, we were able to move into a house in, on the local estate there that, we were able to rent. These were all, I think, subsidised by Shannon Development at the time. So, I mean, that worked fine, even though I was only there for 9 months. Because I had, like I say, interviewed with what was known as Core Memories at the time here in Dublin, later to become known as Data Products. And, they were just starting up and stuff. And like I said, after about 9 months after my interview, I got a letter from them saying with reference to your recent interview, which was like 9 months earlier. Would you like to come talk to us? We'd be interested in progressing it further. So I went to talk to them, and they wanted to, they offered me a job, so we decided to come to Dublin, because at the time as well, Patrick had been in hospital in Dublin and stuff, and we weren't sure where all that was going to lead, but it made more sense to be in Dublin than Shannon. So we left there and came to work in Dublin, and bought the house in Offington.
So how long was that after being in EI? A few years?
No, I was only in EI for 9 months.
Oh, it was only 9 months you were there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Immediately after that, we came to Dublin.
Okay.
So we would have come to Dublin in the middle of, well, not so much the middle, the early part almost of 67.
Okay. And how did you find that relative to kind of back home? Or
Well, it was different. It was, well, I mean, all of the top people in that company were all American, as they were in EI. So, I mean, it didn't feel that much different. You were very familiar with the the culture and things like that, I suppose. They were just American companies transplanted over here. So, I mean, as a result, I never worked for, Irish companies over here as such, not as a, not in a senior position. I'd done summer work and stuff in companies. So, it fitted in easy enough into it, and it worked out well. I progressed well in in those places, and it no complaints.
Very good. Why were American companies? What was the incentive for them to be in Ireland?
Well, at the time, the government through the IDA were working hard at
Was this
trying to
back then
attract
that
them.
they
Oh, it was,
started?
yeah,
Okay.
trying to attract them in, and they were having some success. I mean, they hadn't attracted any worthwhile companies, I suppose, until much later. I mean, it was much later that some of the very big ones like the Dells and the Amdols and Intels and those came in.
But it was mainly, I mean, the tax incentive bringing.
Oh, it
them in,
was,
wasn't it?
yes, yeah. But I mean, Core Memories was an unusual one, and it hasn't happened before or since. They were actually a start-up company, and they came here to develop, a new product, which is the memory products, which using ferrite cores, which was what was used as memories in computers in those days. Which had very small capacity and were very expensive, and I mean it's laughable in relation to the memory capacities and stuff nowadays.
Yeah.
Even in the larger computers, I mean there's 10 times more memory in the smallest little calculator you could find than there was in decent sized computers in those days.
So then the next, number of roles or companies you were in, you're in data products, how
Well,
long?
it's almost 10 years.
And what did you progress then?
Well, we left, there was 3 or 4 of us left data products at the time between here and the States, because we wanted the company, they had been wedded to these ferrite memory type of things, which are obviously, going out of fashion at a fairly rapid rate, and we wanted them to get involved in, semiconductor based memories and semiconductor devices and stuff like that, and they didn't want to do it. They decided not to do it. So 3 or 4 of us decided we'd try our hand at it, because we happened to come across a company in California that was up for sale in this business. Now obviously it was loss making and all that, otherwise we couldn't afford to take it over. So we got involved in that, and we spent 2 years trying to make a fist of that, but it wasn't successful. They were supposed to set up a manufacturing facility over here.
What was the name of the company?
Nanon. It started out as Nanon, and then it became Nitron, I think. And I'm sure it no longer exists. But after 2 years, it became clear that, to me, that the activity here was never going to take off. Whatever they might have some success in the States, and they struggled on with it for a few more years, I think, but I assume it disappeared. So I decided to get out of it, because the income was sporadic at best, and you didn't know the day it was going to dry up completely.
So were they risky days with in terms of income or job security or stuff like that?
Yeah, both, because there was no job security, and income was variable. So I decided to get out of that, and I did some consulting then with some newer companies coming in, because it was freer to do that. And then I took a job I got offered with, and helping some of these out. I got offered the job as the chief executive of a new startup operation in over in Clondalkin. This was in medical healthcare field. They were manufacturing dialysis equipment and dialysis supplies. for people on dialysis, obviously. And was a new startup for that company over here because they were buying the know-how from a German company, and it was going to be transferred over here and started up here. So we did that. That was interesting. So I stayed with them as the, as the top man for 5 years to the day almost. And I left them then, and I went to I went to Amdal because I'd been offered a job there as the chief executive.
Yeah.
And it was in Swords, so it was much more convenient. It was pretty tiresome traipsing back and forth across town. In those days there was no M50, so you had to, so in the morning, I mean, I'd be going off down Capel Street, down to Keys, off out by Houston, off out up the back way into Clondalkin.
Okay. So what would you say your style then as CEO was in in those companies? How would you describe your management style or otherwise?
Well, you'd probably have to ask someone else. Well, hopefully, I think the word would be probably tough but fair.
And someone told me a story there once about in Amdal how you used to know the name of everyone in the company. How many were working there?
There was about 800, I think.
Do you think you knew everyone's name?
No. But these things, you know a fair number of them, and I suppose bluff your way through the rest or whatever, or give the impression that you did. But no, you couldn't know everybody's name because you wouldn't be interacting with them, that often. I mean, a lot of the people you would, but a lot of them you wouldn't. But again, you would get no fare of them because we had a system set up where we had, where every week I would meet for an hour with 10 employees.
Okay.
For a chat session to hear what they had to say and address any issues that they might have. So you would tend to, get to know a fair number of them that way.
Was that something new, or did you hear from that if it was somewhere else?
Well, I think, no, I think it would be in line with the kind of corporate culture at the time. They mightn't have been as dedicated to doing it as we would have been here, because we had a particular issue that they wouldn't necessarily have in the States, and that was our desire to stay non-union, which at the time would have been quite difficult. There was hardly any companies that were successfully non-union, and lots of them had problems with union recognition issues and stuff like that. And I mean, we were determined to keep it non-union and not to have union recognition issues either. So we worked hard at that side of it to make sure that that didn't happen.
And how do you go about doing that? Just by keeping employees?
Well, yes, by
happy,
making sure that they're, that they're well looked after. I mean, they were being paid certainly better than the average, and they were aware of this. But also we would have had a lot of kind of social functions, and each department would have, we would have overall company social activities, a couple of major ones during the year. Each department would have their own, social functions. They had, they had a social fund budget, which, they called a slush fund, which, anytime obviously that came up, I had to dissuade them from using that word, that it wasn't a slush fund. And we're not talking about huge amounts of money now. I mean, there might be, each department might have, I don't know, no more than maybe 50 or 100 euros per person to spend in the whole year. But I mean, if it's spent wisely, they can have, you know, a couple of nights out during the year of, you know, enjoyable camaraderie, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, looking back then on the career side, is there anything, you know, be it innovative management style or otherwise, that kind of, or anything else you'd kind of looking back on it you'd want to share?
Um, no, I think not. I think Abdon was seen, you know, at that time as one of the most innovative companies from a, you know, a management standpoint. And in fact, in one year, I don't know what year it was, the Irish Times used to run a, you know, a management award competition, which we won one year. You know, it was a very prestigious one. There was a big, you know, bronze thing, and it used to be presented at that time by, you know, Charlie Haughey in the Mansion House. And, you know, it was a big kudos for the company to win that.
Very good. So what would have been your role in that?
Well, as the chief executive, I mean, I hopefully set the tone for the place, and you know, set the standards to be achieved, and obviously facilitated it all happening.
But based on what would have been your kind of inspiration for that, or kind of what would have given you that impetus?
Well, the impetus would be that this was how some of the better managed companies were operating. So I obviously took the best of that and tried to, you know, apply it, and tried to make it more of a collegiate type thing rather than a, you know, hierarchical one.
Very good. Okay. Anything else you want to cover there on that?
No.
I guess looking back then overall, close to the end now here, is there anything either we haven't covered you want to say, or just anything you want to share, knowing that this is really aimed at, you know, future generations or whatever, that you want to capture?
Well, I'm trying to think. No, I suppose some of the things, you know, trying to think back over some of the earlier years back around at you know, at home in Ballydesmond and stuff. I remember, you know, there was quite a few activities, I suppose, that was involved with the patch. I mean, I mentioned the stone throwing incident, you know, through the window, but there were other things involved. I know that, and go back to the greyhounds again, because one of the things that used to happen occasionally with greyhounds, I mean, you need a lot of straw as bedding for them, and Patch and I had decided, or maybe more, I had decided and got Patch involved in it, that, you know, one day, because my father might have mentioned we need to go and get some more straw someday from him. And now this was a big task, because we had to go off about 2 miles to a cousin of ours to borrow the donkey and car.
Yeah.
And then we'd have to bring it kind of to our place and go another mile to get the straw and bring it back, and then take the donkey and cart back. So we went off anyhow. We got the donkey and cart, but we were delayed, I think, because we had to wait a while when we went to our cousins for the donkey and cart to be ready, and because we were doing something else, and we eventually got it, and it was starting to get a bit late, but we didn't let that worry us too much. We set off on the donkey and cart, and coming out the long Boreen, coming out the Boreen, Patch fell out of the car, or cart, and the wheel went over him.
Right.
Which was a bit of a downer, as to say. But he was alright, he wasn't hurt. But I suppose that kind of brought a bit of reality into the thing, and we thought it was getting a bit of duskish, stuff like that. So we decided to abandon the thing. But of course, instead of taking the donkey and cart back to the farmer, we decided to tie it to the gate at the end of the morning and leave it there. And we took off and went home.
What age are you?
I suppose we were, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 or something like
Right.
that. and we never heard any more about it ever, which goes back to the point I was making earlier about we probably got away with things that we mightn't otherwise have. With Patch as well, we 1 year, I think we did it 1 year, we might have done it 2 years. We went to work, we had it born on a bog near us, and during the summer we decided to go, and they used to hire casual help as well as permanent help, footing the turf. You had to stoke it up after the machine had laid it out in big rows and kind of sliced it, and you got paid so much a floor for doing this. It was called a floor. There was an area marked out that when you finished this, you qualified for so much pay, and you could do as many of these as you wanted to. You could and stay as long as you wanted to. So Patch and I used to hit one together and keep doing it. And you had to be on your toes a bit as well, because you had to watch out. Because there was guys there now who were expert at it on their own, doing floors, and you see the floors varied. What I mean varied is one floor all the sods would be nicely laid out and was easy to stoke them. Others the bloody sods would be stuck together and heaped together and stuff because something went wrong with the machine, and you still get that. Now the foreman who was marking out the floors was supposed to take all that into account, and if you had a very bad one it would be smaller in physical size than the ones that were easy, which would be bigger. But even though it was small, it was still an awful lot of work. It was very hard on your fingers and stuff. So you'd have to be on the lookout, because all these other guys would be looking out as well. Like say when you finished your floor, that you knew kind of the next floor that was going to be coming up available was a nice one that you'd have to go on to. So it was a little tricky, and sometimes we'd part company and go on, and one of us would take the new floor because it was a good one, and the other one would stay finishing the old one.
Right.
But there was little trick acts like that you learned in life.
You get a few arguments as a result.
Not so much. I mean, no, they were all right. I'd say if you tried abusing the thing, they might complain to the foreman or that, but they wouldn't say anything to you directly, because again, they were depending on it for their livelihood. We weren't. I mean, it was pocket money for us, as it were. So they never did anyway. But I mean, no, they wouldn't, because they'd all have been local. There wasn't like they were, there were strangers that, I mean, I know the thing was probably about 3 miles away from us, but everybody would have known, everybody else.
Right.
And the other, if you want a real mischief type one, but this was with the approval of our parents, or at least I think it was. We used to have get a goose at Christmas dinner, and sometimes the goose would be live. You get it live, you'd have to plug in everything else. And I remember one Christmas we were, at least I think we were, I mean, as my memory says, we were assigned the task of killing this goose. Again, it might be someone mentioned the goose had to be killed or something, and we took it upon ourselves to, do this job. So I can remember, all there was to kill this goose was a hatchet. And I think I convinced Patch to hold the goose down when I was going to hit it with a hatchet. Hit it in the neck, cut the neck off it. I can't remember exactly what happened. I don't know if we ever, if we gave up or not, because obviously Patch rightly was a bit nervous about all of this, and I think he might have opted out after a little while. And I'd say we probably never did it, but that was the plan anyway.
Very good. That's a good one to finish on, I think. Unless there's anything else you want to cover.
No, there's probably other things, but I don't think there's anything significant. I mean, we used to do the usual things, we'd be fishing and in the river and stuff like that, and we'd be, we used to go swimming in the river. I mean, not many people used to go swimming. There was only one there at the end of the village, the Blackwater River. There was one, reasonable size pool of water in the river. That was kind of where we'd go swimming, but it wasn't, there'd be a few others around. If you got very warm weather like we had there recently, you'd have a lot more people, but usually there wouldn't be that many.
Yeah.
But the fishing, we do a lot of fishing probably when but you needed flood water because it was coarse fishing, you needed worms and you put them on a hook and we'd go off fishing and we used to catch a few fish, not a huge number. I can tell you wouldn't live on it, but which wasn't too bad. But you catch the odd eel, and I don't know if you ever fished and caught an eel, but they're the worst things to deal with, because you have to get this thing taken off the hook.
Yeah.
And so an eel is very slippery. You have to try and stand on it and hold it on the ground where you take the hook out, because you don't want the eel. You kick the eel back into the river. But of course, they had very sharp teeth, and I mean you wouldn't have any gloves or knives or anything, with you in those days.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to cut the head off the eel or anything to, stop it biting you. You had to deal with. All you had was the fishing rod and yourself and a jar of worms, and that was it.
Sounds like fun.
Well,
So
it was fun, but
you didn't take it up, keep it as a pastime?
no. Well, I just remember when with the kids we used to go, doing the odd little bit of mackerel fishing, but that was like shooting fish in a barrel. You just throw in the string of hooks with feathers on them and you haul it out, and there was fish at the end. No, it was a lot more, it was a lot tougher than that. You'd have to spend a day to get a few fish.
Tough all, yeah, the different times I suppose, yeah. A good way to relax I suppose after
Yeah,
the
I suppose the
work
only
of the
thing
week
then,
or...
when we were younger, I mean, family outings as such, if you call them that, family outings would have been, we'd go to Ballybunion to the strand, which is about 30 miles away or so, every, so often. So you'd spend the whole day on the strand and stuff like that. And you'd meet the uncles as well back then, because they all lived in, except for, during the summer, Ernest, who lived up in Donegal, would be down there, but all the other uncles were living in North Kerry, all teachers as well, so they had the summer off, so you'd meet those there. And then the regular outings, there'd be regular days outings to, shopping to Tralee or to Castle Island. That would happen a lot of Saturdays. You'd rummage around the shops and stuff, and you get some comic books and things like that out of it. Not much, mind you. It'd be more rummaging around than anything else.
What would Santa have brought you?
Well, we'd get presents. I think a lot of people didn't get them at Christmas, but we used to get presents. Every Christmas, various things. I mean, genuine little toys and things like that. And I think that was, I don't say it I better not say this because this could appear in the video and it might be looked at by the...
Got anything?
It was like in relation to Christmas, like you'd wake up in the middle of the night after Santa had come and, if you were first up, you'd see what everybody's toys were and stuff, and you would decide to maybe swap a few around and stuff that say, well, I prefer that to this, and you'd find out the following day then that you'd be corrected and told by my mother or something, no, that Santa brought that to this one. Now it should have given you a clue as to the, Santa, but it didn't till much later.
Right.
And the other interesting thing, which doesn't happen anymore apparently, is small Santa used to come. on the 6th of January.
Okay.
Little Christmas as it was known, so it was small Santa because it was Little Christmas. But all we'd get then was fruit and maybe, you know, maybe some sweets of that.
Right.
But that practice seems to have died out. There's no Little Christmas and Little Santa anymore.
Yeah. Very good.
So that was one of the things. I don't, I think that covers, you know, most of some of the recollections that I have from the, you know, those earlier days. Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about the early days earlier about the no electricity and no running water and things like that, and also, I mean, it meant you had to go to the well for water.
Yeah.
So you'd have to go off about half a mile. We used to go up to Rings mostly for the well, and you'd have to bring 2 buckets of water, you know, about a half a mile, which was no easy task. And, you know, that had to be done, you know, fairly frequently because that was your source of water used in the house. But the other thing that, you know, when you think back on it, it would really strike you was that in those days, because there was no street lights, nothing, it was pitch dark at night. You know, it was pitch dark, and if there wasn't a house around with a little light on the window, you know, there was nothing. You know, and there was no cars going by with lights on or anything like that. And even if you met somebody out, you know, 9 times out of 10 they had no light on their bike or no light on their horse and cart or anything.
Yeah.
It was pitch dark. I mean, you'd have to hear things. It was eerie, which meant, of course, if you were visiting anywhere and like that at night, there'd always be stories about, you know, passing the graveyard and things like that, and you wouldn't dream of going by the graveyard after dark. You know, you'd imagine all kinds of things would happen.
Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't be caught dead.
Very good. I mean, was storytelling a big part then?
Oh, it was. Well, when you'd go to houses, like, say, when we were a bit older now, I certainly, and some of the others would as well, go to different houses. You know, you'd go playing cards was a big thing. There'd be houses where there was cards played every night. Also, you know, there'd be storytelling as part of that, you know, during the playing of the cards and stuff, and there'd be stories told, and you know, there wouldn't be a grain of truth, I would say, in practically all of them. You know, there was a few, well-known storytellers around the place, and you know, they were just that, they were stories.
Yeah.
But a lot of them would be hair-raising ones. I mean, you'd be, you know, you'd be afraid you wouldn't come home from there on your own. You know, you'd come with someone else who happened to be going by. Now, these would have been adults that we would have been younger, more impressionable, and whereas they knew that there were, you know, stories. It didn't bother them.
Very good. All right. I think we've
Yeah, sure, we
a
can
good bit
always
there.
hit it again if they're necessary.
Yeah. Definitely right.
Anything we've
I'll
missed.
pause there.